So, this is going to be fairly quick because I've got an appointment in about a couple hours at 2 p.m. We're going to be talking about kinetic direction reflection / resonance. It's an old idea I've had for a long time about how this possible alien technology might work for a engine / drive that has a directionality of its movement added to it without so much exothermal excitation sort of thing. So a good way to describe this is pretty simplistic. Imagine if you were to have a diaphragm on like any old speaker will do. Now, because the air was cold, it was falling down towards where the speaker is, but there's a tube around it, okay? And the speaker is, of course, attached, the diaphragm this is, to not just the tube, but also the air. Now, what we're talking about is very simplistically going to look an awful lot like an acoustic pump. The difference here is in really realistically what kinetic directionality means. See, chaotic kinetic means thermal. But when you can align the tube with a little bit of static electricity in this instance, and you can pulse it up and down together with the vibration of the diaphragm, you get alignment like a laminar coherenting of the air inside of the tube. And so for the transfer downward direction of the tube on the diaphragm, when appropriately resonated, meaning oscillating correctly, you get thrust produced for the given air inside of the tube. Now, the static charge is not what actually moves anything at all. It simply allows for the alignment of the poles and the overall structure of the gas inside of the tube. Now, as a result of this, you're able to create a resonant kinetic direction to all the gas, thus allowing for it to stay much more statically still. It transfers air into where it resultively removed some of its air towards the top, creating a pump, a thrusting pump, for a lot less overall energy. The air inside of the tube doesn't leave. Of course, can't completely control that, but you do create an air pump by doing this. Now, extrapolating as a result from that, given basic principle, and it's been done before, trust me, I'm aware of that. If you take into account a stronger magnetic and electrostatic field within inside of a given containment, let's say it was the tic-tac of the alien possible UAP whatever the fucks, and you happen to utilize a permanent and electromagnet field along with the alignment of the orbitals, the electron orbitals of the given material in between, allow for it to kinetically try to thrust what is in the inside and outside, and of course the tube in between the two has to come along with it. But then you bounce, but not really bounce. You see, you're not really bouncing, you're adding energy to a resonant kinetic direction. You're aligning some of these poles, you're aligning some of these electron orbitals to allow for a very, very directionality kinetic oscillatory frequency. And because it can shift in between the two, and it can be imparted with more energy, you get a seemingly non-Newtonian, opposing Newtonian physics law engine. Seemingly. It's not. It is doing exactly what it's supposed to do with equal and opposite reactions. It stores the energy and it reflects it back to allow for forward directional movement. Now, since we always have a constant pressure, gravity in this instance, nearly constant throughout the entirety of our planet, we have charge field differences between our ground, our air, and our electromagnetic poles of our planet, accounting for the thermals between the two sides of these electrostatic and electromagnetic permanent styles, and the kinetic reflector diaphragm in the rear and or front, respectively. You're able to realign and thrust against these given phenomenon, quantum and regular forces that exist. There's no tunneling necessary. We are simply making kinetic become extraordinarily simplified and ordered without needing to cool it off nearly, in fact, at all. We are simply oscillating between the two and allowing for the vast majority of capture to be reflected in the direction of travel that we'd wish for it to do, and now have, for the given amount of energy, which we don't need nearly as much as you might expect, so long as you're able to align the fields correctly in between each other. Let's take a ceramic that allows for electromagnetic and permanent magnet with a electrostatic difference. We allow for the oscillatory alignment phenomenon of the electron orbitals in conjunction with the kinetic potential energy of the material, let's say with steel, in between it. That of course has a nucleus that is quite a bit more massive than the electrons. Now, thermally, we use this in an exothermic reaction captured to produce a given amount of thrust and or turn, otherwise known as torque. Of course, there's conversion losses every step of the way, but what if we didn't need to do that? What if we could suck in kinetic and allow for a little bit of those electrons to do a little bit more kinetic potentiation with the diaphragm of directionality? Well, we can do that. We can do that fairly easily. In fact, we're not talking about ionic drives, we're not talking about reaction drives, we're not talking about non-Newtonian engine physics. We're talking about utilizing workarounds that we can do very soon to produce a directionality of kinetic capture and movement that is only ever allowed to push and pull one direction. There's no need for exothermic release. It would capture heat to a degree and expend it in the direction of travel. Much like I was stating, to a degree, I was doing with my electric motor that uses electromagnetic fields, electrostatic, kinetic, and momentum current, meaning kinetic thermal alignment, and momentum, which isn't really totally a momentum, it's really just an eddy current that switches off and on to resist direction opposite that then acts like a capacitor dumping into the kinetic directionality of travel. In a simplified manner, that's effectively all it's doing. But it comes with a massive increase of torque and efficiency. Now, same thing will occur with a engine drive like this. Efficiency goes up once alignment and once the given amount of continued frequency and directionality of kinetic occurs. You see, mass for the given volume, cube law theory, still exists. With the correct material that allows for, upon movement as a diaphragm, kinetic alignment to be reflected. It doesn't need to be near perfect. It just needs to do its job well enough, with not too much in terms of loss. There's always going to be degrees, so it doesn't matter. Of loss, that is. Now, because that mass is greater than the degree of loss and the directionality of travel is greater one direction versus another, of course it will continuously move that direction. The opposite reaction is just simply captured and moved towards the direction of travel that you wish for it to go towards. This is all it's doing. In a resonance capacity that allows for you to increase that degree of direction, because of course you have to expend some energy to do this. It's not fully passive. But that's fine. We're willing to expend large sums of energy on exothermic reactions to propel our spacecraft and jets and more. So why wouldn't we put some effort into that? What's the problem? The whys as to why this works is very rather simplistic. For the given resonance reversed one side to the other, it is countered by a greater increase of travel one direction than another, in terms of the size of mass and inertia going on for that given mass. It's not a simplistic to imagine thing, okay? We're talking about quantum fields, kinetic, potential, and electrodynamic, thermodynamic forces being used correctly to allow for this phenomenon to occur. The best part is, we know it does. Everything I just stated is nothing in any way crazy or out of this world. Put them together, though, it certainly makes that happen. We already know about these things existing. Every phenomenon I just stated does have a plethora, many meta-studies done about them that have been meta-analysis, I suppose. That go along with it being possible. We're not talking about exotic energies anymore. We're not talking about any negatives or positives. We're simply talking about hitting something just ever so right with the right frequency to allow for direction of travel to the given materials within, to be redirected mostly as best we can towards a forward direction that we wish to go. It's a very counterintuitive idea. We're going to use kinetic captured towards a given direction, with using a little bit of our electricity and the goings-on around us to therein help allow for that direction of travel to be exponentiated. A given amount of thrust for the air around us, captured, moved, and ultimately thrusted as well, can be done too, even in such a way that we will be able to align and again, both not only attract, but produce a neutral reaction to the kinetic potential and electrodynamic forces of charge of the electron's orbits, producing a near superfluid-like state as a boundary layer around the given craft, while still being able to capture it and thrust it faster and faster without adding any heat to it, like an ionic drive, except a little different in this instance, as it uses kinetic potentiation dumped into the direction of travel, thus imparting its opposite reaction onto the craft. Very much like an ionic, but not quite the same, because it's kinetic. As a result, you would be able to gain what appears to be no exothermic excitation and no real way for it to have accelerated as fast as it does, float around doing seemingly nothing, resisting the gravity without a buoyancy, and can travel in nearly any and all directions should you properly set up the drive and engine correctly. This makes it so that way the idea of it being impossible to do these things becomes possible. The reason why many people would go, why aren't we doing this now, is pretty simplistic to me. Because we've only just recently got to a point where we've understood that this is a possibility in quantum physics. This was theorized as a possibility back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, when we started imagining these things to exist, never quite understanding how to put it together. Getting ever further and further on how each one of the phenomenons could be there to allow for this to occur. Otherwise known as the physics that we have learned about quantum mechanics and fields. As a result, what I hear from people that say it's not fucking possible, I go, oh, so horses making your little carriage go vroom vroom inside of a little cylinder that we turn a shaft is not possible. We couldn't possibly have come up with a way to put forward a sucking force and then compression force and then that excitation thermally, again through a given nozzle, to allow for a given amount of thrust of a burning of a molecule, exciting the cleaving and combination there within with other molecules to produce a given amount of reactive Newtonian force. All of which this would be doing, just slightly different. We would be reducing the given amount of resistance of travel from one of the materials into a slightly different direction to be amplified again towards another direction. Let's say it was heading towards the opposite direction. Well, all it would do is simply divert it, not perfectly rearward, but off at an angle, captured and then accelerated towards the direction of travel that you want for it to travel. The skin in between the material you initially allow to move rearwards. with your diaphragmic reflection. Kind of like a turbine Pelton wheel, reflects it nearly reverse, impart some of its energy. But there's nothing saying I can't take that rearward direction and put a little pump there, suck it in, and thrust it the same way. Which is effectively the only thing that's going on. So when you tell me you cannot do this, I go, because of your lack of imagination and creativity and intelligence, you were unable to find a feasible way to do it. That doesn't mean in any way it can't be done. Sorry. It doesn't matter what you think. And this is the kinetic direction reflection resonance engine by yours truly, Xenon Reality, John Tyler Lemke. That's a pretty simplistic way of getting about it. And in fact, I've thought about figuring out a better way to do it with fewer amounts of fuel for a given tiny little motorcycle engine. Should I be able to get a shroud and a intake within a given tube with the right stators and resonances to allow for, with a little bit of electromagnetic and electrostatic, utilizing a Joule-Thomson-like acoustic pump that fires in an oscillatory manner, a more directionality approach, kind of like the Pelton again, of accelerated gases towards the direction of travel we're looking to get, then have the cooled, as a result of imparting its given amount of energy in the direction of travel, and still we have the ability to take some of that energy we did not capture for the direction that we'd wanted to travel, and capture it instead with a waste heat generator that simply uses the mechanical stresses and strain of heating and cooling with piezoelectrics in series and parallel to be captured and help redirect, utilizing the very thing I was just saying for resonances and electromagnetics and electrostatics, all while the accelerated air travels through nearer the center to create a greater degree of vacuum through the Venturi and Bernoulli's principle as it's accelerated, and then expands to help capture and redirect in a Joule-Thomson-like cycle. The resonance of its kinetic energy upon combustion to be redirected and focused in the direction of travel you want it to go. While I lose a certain amount of any Newtonian types of physics, I'm not looking to get high degrees of thrust from any amount of the gas expanding and escaping. I want it to equal 1 atmosphere, nearly the same amount of energy, meaning thermally, that it has coming in, making it far more efficient as an engine and capture of its exothermic kinetics to direction of travel. Nothing says I can't really do that. In fact, it would be a fairly simplistic design if I could get money and a 3D printer and anything of an income, which I don't have. But something says it would work, because nothing says it can't. You know what I mean? In fact, all that is a less pressure, higher pressure Stirling effect with a resonance acoustic Joule-Thomson cycle pump, all imparting directionality of energy in a given direction of movement, while reducing resistance that direction by allowing for kinetic alignment and then a oscillatory effect of the two shrouds and the fluid in between, with the resonance of the funnel and shroud outside to realign more directionally speaking, a continued imparting knock that direction. Not too difficult when you think about it. But you'd have to be something of a genius, I suppose, to see it. Or maybe I'm just too confident. Still, I'd like to try. Why not? Give it a shot. Doesn't seem that terrible to have one. So I don't get as much thrust. I'm not using nearly as much hydrocarbon as you, am I? My efficiency could be far higher and greater. There's nothing saying I can't do that. Just capture energy from the air. Still has heat. Use some of the electricity within. You only need to burn just enough to keep the heat for it to gain enough of this directionality of kinetic movement, pushing and pulling the occupant of the motorcycle or bicycle to the given desired speed, kind of like a compression ignition diesel. Doesn't sound so impossible or insane in the slightest. Seems like, really realistically, it could be done fairly quickly. And the efficiency of the imparted thermals would be recaptured pretty darn well. There's nothing saying it can't be done. The only thing that says it can't be done is a bunch of people that aren't quite as creative, aren't quite as willing to say, I don't care what the status quo says, I don't care what conventional wisdom tells me, I don't care what others think. I'm gonna give it a shot. Why the fuck not? Let's see if I can figure out a solution that makes it happen. Why not? Why the hell not? That's how we got to the moon. That's how we got bombs that destroyed cities. That's how we got general relativity. That's how we got a lot of things that progressed us in a positive direction, even if at first they weren't so positive. Why the hell not? Try and figure out a solution that makes it even better and works even more. Why the fuck not? It's basically a spring in the rear, just a little bit better at doing it. That's a little passé, so I want to get into this a little bit better. You see, kinetic potential is hard to redirect. And it has to eventually be imparted in a given way. So my particular way of doing this in this aspect for more of a less than moving a motorcycle was more having a electron orbital field where most of the electrons were on one directionality of side, with enough of these all headed, let's say it was to the left. If you were to look at it like a clock, it'd be at the 9 o'clock position. Many of them look like they're mostly in that area. Except it thinks, because of this, that the electrons at the front are kind of a part of the electrons in the rear. But when kinetics, potential in this instance, give it a drop in that superposition-like state, it says, actually, no, I'm not there. Go the hell that way. I'm right here. Go that way. Then you get the Newton's cradle. But then you get a nucleus that also moves that direction, because of course it has to impart that given field energy, kinetic potential, into that direction. If you're able to align your diaphragm correctly, vibrate it, in this instance I wouldn't use one, I'd use multiple, specifically to try and allow for it to be as a filter to the main diaphragm that then sends it to that direction. That way it would be less likely and less inclined to need near perfection of diaphragmic reflection. A bunch of words that just means it has to hit it perfectly, which is stupid, and I hate that whole idea. So instead, it's like, now we have gearing, and or a crankshaft has multiple diaphragms to allow for it to properly always be reflected the correct way. Now, it would seem insane to some to believe it's possible, but I don't have to do that. Why should I? Insane? I don't care. They called other people insane. Some of them were, some of them weren't. History constantly needs people to challenge old ideas and try and give it a shot. What's the problem? Why not give it a shot? Jeez, get over yourself. Stop trying to make people think only one direction. Now, you don't just need a diaphragm. Of course, there's the electrostatic and electromagnetic, which has to equal this given speed of frequency. Turns out, we do have femto and more, quickly altering and pulsing fields and laser designs. Nothing says we can't do that. As far as I'm aware, we could still do it. So why not? So it's a controller that's really rather quick, but okay. We've got those. Maybe it's a little expensive. The basic prototype would be a given amount of oscillating frequencies. We don't need it to go that hard. We would just need to section it to equalize within given areas of the amount of hertz rate that you have available on hand to allow for this effect to occur in a more passive and active manner. Divide the cross-sectional area of the given size of tube and or funnel or whatever, it should still work. Nothing states it shouldn't. Nothing states it can not work. In fact, it really only states that it should be possible. We're just not maybe making it happen just right. But now we know a lot more about resonances. We know a lot more about how springs don't necessarily need to hit exactingly precise to get what you need. Just within a given bell curve should do it more often than not. There you go. That's how I would do the idea of a spring that doesn't really have a spring per se attached to it, but a reflector to its given reduction of energy to the given direction of travel desired. Air is a pretty decent little spring. Certain materials are pretty good at being able to reflect kinetics, and the right geometric structures and shapes should really increase the effect, especially when you can impart more thanks to kinetics and electrostatic and electromagnetic alignments. Huzzah, we have a seemingly, if it's done appropriately and we get there, no need for ginormous, ridiculous gallons of hydrogens and oxygens to get to space, or so on for hydrocarbons to move our cars and planes around, or even boats. We could design it into our very hulls, the very structure of the car and more, and impart it into ourselves too as we go through to reduce the given felt gravitational g-force of our acceleration, making it far more efficient for us to travel that way. Seemingly traveling faster than the g-force would allow for us to sustain, because you see the material and the people, occupants inside, are all suddenly traveling nearly the same speed. You'd have a much easier time accelerating consistently at a higher than what is felt g-force than otherwise believed possible. Materials that normally could never withstand this are now able to withstand it. People that could never handle that can now handle it. Structures, sizes before never imagined, absolutely possible. You just gotta figure out how to do it the right way. There you go. That's my proposed way of getting past the idea of rocket engines that NASA produces. There you go.